welcome to our second in the annual series, Ethics Week. If you joined us yesterday, hope you found it engaging. Today we have Drew Buscareno here with us to speak about servant leadership. So I'll tell you a little bit about him, and we'll leave time at the end of the discussion for some question and answer. So particularly my students, try to think of some really wonderful questions to ask our guests today, okay? Drew assumed the responsibilities of Assistant Vice President for University Relations at Notre Dame in December of 2003. His core responsibilities include directing the university's Advisory Council program, which is comprised of 16 councils and 630 volunteer members, leading the President's Circle and Kavanaugh Council, which is Notre Dame's most prestigious annual giving society, managing the strategic and annual planning for the University Relations Division, and coordinating donor relations and services on behalf of the Vice President. Prior to his current post, he served at the Center for the Homeless here in South Bend, and he was, for some time, the executive director of that center. A two-time grad of Notre Dame, Drew left South Bend in 1991 with a BA in history and a minor in business administration to work as a Holy Cross associate volunteer at an AIDS center founded by Mother Teresa in Oakland, California. Drew returned to South Bend in 1992 to work at the Homeless Center. He earned his master's in nonprofit management from Notre Dame in '96, and he and his wife Emily have 2 young boys, so they're well rooted in our community. So please welcome Drew Buscareno.
Thank you. Great to be with you guys today. Thank you for this opportunity. So as you can see by the introduction, I have the completely unplanned career. Right? So there was no real career path. But I want to actually begin this conversation with actually I'm going to call it a leadership prayer, and it's a prayer that I just learned, and it came from a gentleman named Alex McMurtry. He's one of our advisory council members. He's Notre Dame class of 1957. So he has kept this prayer in his wallet since Father Ted gave it to him at his graduation from Notre Dame in 1957. And it got me thinking a little bit more about servant leadership. So the prayer goes like this. Lord, give us the ambition to do as much as we can, as well as we can, as long as we can, and the resolve not to despair over the things that we cannot do. Amen. So it's sort of a leadership prayer to begin with. So I'm going to offer some reflections on servant leadership. I'll talk a little bit about sort of, the definition of servant leadership and how we can think about these sort of 2 terms that are combined together. I'll share some different examples and actually a pretty wide range of examples of servant leaders and in some ways sort of stories about servant leadership. I'll talk about some key qualities of servant leaders and then sort of, what I call sort of the practice of servant leadership. And then we'll certainly have time for conversation. I think to me what's striking is at first glance, servant leadership is just paradoxical by definition. When we think of servants, we're not thinking about leaders and leadership. And often when we think about leadership, we're not thinking about servants or perhaps at times sort of service to others. So there's sort of this paradox in the term servant leadership. But it's actually, to me, it's that paradox which is really the key to trying to understand what I'll call sort of the ethos of servant leadership. My experience of servant leadership out of my, I'm going to say sort of varied and perhaps at times disjointed career is you sort of know it when you feel it. Can you sort of ascribe that, hey, if you do this, this, and this, you are a servant leader? No, but there's something really authentic about it that people can sort of recognize. Folks who sort of ascribe to more of a servant leadership type of approach. So, sort of it's hard to define. It's a bit ambiguous, but at the same time, when you're around it, you sort of know it, and it can be really sort of inspiring, and it can really, I think, drive incredible performance. And also it can really drive sort of the engagement and sort of full human development of people who are part of those organizations. So here are, just to start, some stories that have always sort of have stuck with me, and I record these kind of stories just for myself over time so I can reflect upon them. The first one is, now it's Father Dave Link, but at the time he was Dean David Link. He was Dean of the Notre Dame Law School, and it goes back to sort of the beginnings of the Center for the Homeless. So Dave Link and a gentleman named Darcy Chisholm, who worked for the Institute for Church Life at Notre Dame, were part of an association of different sort of churches and church leaders in our community that were trying to respond to the growing problem of homelessness in South Bend in the mid to the late 1980s. And they would, from November 1st to April 1st, they would open up this overnight shelter in a place called the Maranatha Temple. The building is still there on South Michigan Street. It's right across the street from 813 South Michigan Street, where I spent many years of my life. So they would open it up from, at night, typically at 8 o'clock, and then it would open up at 8 o'clock at night, and then it would close down at 6 a.m. But here's what they would do every night. Is they would wash the feet of all those people who were coming into that overnight shelter. And they would do this practice, right, every night, night after night. They would wash what I would only imagine to be dirty, grimy, smelly, fungal-infested feet of the homeless, right? And it would be Dave Link, Darcy Chisholm, and then there were actually a lot of Notre Dame and St. Mary students who would volunteer. I can remember I lived in Dillon Hall, and they would call for students to volunteer overnight at this overnight shelter. And the fascinating thing about this story is, after doing this sort of night after night, some students, while they were washing feet with Dave Link, turned to him and said, can't we do a lot more than just wash feet? Why can't we, we know, and they could see the high incidence of mental illness, right? They could see how sick people were, just physically sick. And then they knew the obvious, the lack of jobs and other resources. And that began for Dave and Darcy, and a number of other volunteer leaders, the articulation of a vision which became the Center for the Homeless, was to really figure out how do we do more in a much more sort of holistic model. But to me, that image of servant leadership, of being on your knees and washing the feet of really sort of the most forgotten and nameless in our society, but then connecting that to sort of the articulation of a really compelling vision to do much more. It's sort of a glimpse, I think, of servant leadership. So another story. This is and many of you who sort of, perhaps spend a little bit of time in the main building, you would have interacted with this person before. There's a woman named Rosie in the main building, and she's in building services. And so Rosie cleans the bathrooms and takes care of the facility. But I look to Rosie as being an incredible example of a servant leader, because she knows a little bit about everybody that she interacts with in the main building. So she knows about my children. And she's able, I may not see Rosie for 2-3 months, but but she has this incredible ability to sort of, in some ways, keep track of what's happening in, what I'd say is my busy, hectic, harried life in such a thoughtful and compassionate way. And I look at that example, and so, on the surface, Rosie, in her institutional role at Notre Dame, is in a very direct service, sort of janitorial role. But what I would articulate is she's able to express the mission of Notre Dame and serve as sort of an example of who we're called to be as sort of individuals in service of this mission in a very powerful way. So I think one of the insights I have about servant leadership is that those who practice it, in many ways, just like sort of those students in the basement of the Maranatha Temple, they can really transcend whatever sort of organizational hierarchy their formal position may place them into. And so Rosie, for me, is an example of, Rosie, for me, is definitely an example for that. So another example. One of my great mentors was a volunteer at the Center for the Homeless, a guy named Francis Scott. Everybody knew him as Scotty. Now Scotty was, if we were to look at his career, right? Scotty was a bread truck driver and drove a bread truck route for probably 30 or 35 years. Now, I came to know him at the end of his career, which really for him became his full-time volunteer career. So after he, likely, probably the best thing to say was that he was sort of downsized out of his bread truck driving career when his company was closed in this region. And then he began to sort of commit himself to full-time volunteer work. And so Scotty would, he would take me fishing once a year. So we would go fishing together, and I had a chance to spend a decent amount of time with him. But Scotty organized all of the donations to the Center for the Homeless. So anybody who comes in with clothing, food, toys, food, whatever it might be, Scotty was, until he passed away, was for many years the organizer of that. And so one time, but everybody naturally gravitated towards Scotty. And so I asked him. I said, how come so many people feel feel inspired by sort of what you do and how you do it? And he said something. He said, he goes, with all our guests or with everybody else, he said, I never try to tell people what they need to do. He said, I really sort of spend my time just sort of listening to them and encouraging them and maybe asking them on occasion to think about something else. He said, but, I don't worry about if people are heeding my advice. So he spent all these years, in many ways, I would say being a great witness and being this, sort of this powerful but very quiet and humble presence. So I looked to him and I but there was a very intense drive there. Certainly there was an intense drive for service, but there was a humility and really sort of a commitment to sort of the growth of those around them. So Scotty is someone who really comes to mind. Another example for me is Monk, and I got a chance to know Father Malloy because he helped found the Center for the Homeless. And then certainly early in my tenure before, sort of at the end of Father Malloy's tenure as president, I had a chance to work, a little bit more closely with him. And to me, this incredible example of a priest president who has spent, certainly spent his entire career as president and has since continued to do so, that chose to live in Soren Hall. And sort of keep the, in many ways, the hours of students. And those who live in Soren Hall, and even those who don't, I mean, you can still go call on Monk whenever you'd like. You don't want to call on him early in the morning, but you can do that. So this, this sort of witness and this example of really sort of being with those whom you are called to serve. So there's something, when I think of servant leadership, there's something very grounded that that leadership philosophy is all about being, I'll say sort of being in the trenches. It is not removed at all. So it's an experience of, and whatever the institutional role is, it's very much grounded in that, what the end of the day is, we could say who you're directly called to serve. So for Monk, it was always very important that he was sort of living with students, and was in that sort of milieu, the entire time. Just as I would say, Scotty sort of immersed himself in the milieu of homelessness, just as Father Dave Link sort of was in that milieu the whole time, and that really then inspired their whole vision for how they wanted to, to lead. In reflecting upon this, I don't know about many of you. I've really been struck by some of the examples of Pope Francis very early on in his tenure, because I think in many ways, sort of some of these same attributes that I'm talking about with these other folks are similar to to Pope Francis. So he's chosen to live in sort of modest apartments, and not the papal apartments. He dines in, what we would articulate as sort of a Vatican cafeteria. Now, yes, he's dining with the rest of the curia, but it's, most popes sort of dine in the, their own apartments. He's, very consistently, interestingly, from the moment he was nominated, he's chosen to sort of eschew what we would say is the traditional, traditional garb, and even sort of some of the traditional roles of the, the church. I mean, one of my favorite stories is that he was delayed coming out on the balcony because he wouldn't wear the most ornate papal robes, and he insisted that they bring him much simpler garments, which they had to then, sort of go and find. But there's this, this notion of sort of being with, and trying to sort of continue to sort of ground himself in the reality of those that he sees himself as trying to, to lead and serve. So I think it's a very powerful example, and again, gives us some insight into sort of this definition or notion of, of servant leadership. Now, for me, I'm evaluated, right? So every year, my evaluation, I report to our vice president is Lou Nanny. And for those who work on the development and the fundraising side of the university, we are absolutely evaluated by dollars raised. Now, there's other components of the evaluation process that go into it, but it's a pretty darn bottom line driven. I think it's no different than our coaches who are evaluated by wins and losses as a dominant evaluation, or by the folks who work on the investment side and who are evaluated by investment returns. So it's a very clear cut. You sort of know if you succeed, you know if you don't. Like my number for this year is at $11.5 million. So I know exactly every day how I'm tracking towards $11.5 million. So I couldn't, in many ways, couldn't come before you without a great fundraising story. So the last story, and I'll read a little bit of this one, is one that I've kept now for about 8 or 9 years. And again, it offers us a little bit different insight into servant leadership. This one's actually about Golda Meir. So this story really begins in in sort of 1948, right? So think of the time frame in 1948. So right post-World War II, in many ways right before sort of the formation of the official state of Israel. And at the time, I think there were a little bit more than 500,000 Jews in Palestine. And everybody knew that war with the Arab states was coming. I mean, there was no doubt that war was coming. So this is January 1948. And the leader of, the Jewish, sort of what was soon to become the Jewish state was David Ben-Gurion, right? So David Ben-Gurion sends Golda Meir to the United States. Now, she had lived in the United States for a number of years, very comfortable in the United States. He sent her here to raise money for the impending war, knowing that the Arabs an attack was imminent. And that so Golda Meir arrives in the United States in New York City, and sort of leading members of the Jewish community say, this is not the right time. We've already given enough. We've done enough for you, and we've done enough, and you're not going to find too receptive audience, and don't come. So Golda Meir hastily they sort of organize a meeting in Chicago with sort of leading members of of the Jewish community around the United States. So here's what she said. She said, "Please believe me when I tell you that I have not come to the United States only because several 100,000 Jews are in danger of being killed. That is not the issue. The issue is that if the Jews of Palestine survive, then the Jews of the world survive with them, and their freedom will be assured forever. But if these several 100,000 are wiped off the face of the earth, then there will be no Jewish people as such and for centuries to come. All our hopes and dreams of a Jewish nation, a Jewish homeland, will be smashed. My friends, when I say we need money immediately, I don't mean next week, I mean right now. In less than 4 months, we will be fighting for our lives against cannon and armor. It is not for you to decide whether we will fight. That decision is taken. We will fight. We will pay for the birth of our nation with our blood. That is normal. The best among us will fall. That is certain. You can decide only one thing, whether we win or lose." So the next day, David Ben-Gurion, calls her, or there's some exchange with him, and he was hoping that she could raise $5 million. So in that one night, she raised $50 million. So what happened then? So 10 times the amount. So that's January of 1948. So in May of 1948, Israel declares independence. That was on May 14th, right? And then May 15th, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan and Iraq attack the state of Israel. And we have that long month, that 8 months of war. I think what you will find with servant leaders is they have an ability to articulate a vision for not only what is happening today, they can connect people with the past, and they create sort of a very compelling vision for the future. Now, I think certainly the more visionary and sort of well-known leaders, right, are able to sort of communicate this verbally, right? But I do think that the experience of servant leadership is that many people can sort of communicate that through just sort of regular daily acts, that those that especially have some sort of symbolic power communicate very powerfully a sort of a vision for what can be, not for the leader, but for whatever the cause or focus that they have. So those are some stories about, for me in my life, sort of examples of servant leadership. Some that I think are remarkably humble, and others which, are sort of well known to history. Now, as I've sort of reflected upon this, and especially in my own, I would say spiritual journey in life, I've looked for sort of a model of, okay, how do you think about or aspire to be a, servant leader? And I think we can find a model in the beautiful story of the road to Emmaus. And so, I think we can recall that story. So it's the day of the resurrection, and Jesus is walking, the 7 miles to Emmaus from Jerusalem, and he encounters two people walking along. They don't recognize him, and he asks them what they're talking about, and they say they tell him the whole story of what just happened in Jerusalem before the crucifixion, and then his own crucifixion, and then the tales that they had heard that morning that he was no longer in the tomb. But they don't recognize him. He continues to walk with them, listening to their story. And then as they complete their story, he begins to tell them and put that sort of his story, the Messianic story, in the context of all of the Hebrew Scriptures. And so he sort of educates them and sheds great light on his life and his experience and his coming. They go into Emmaus, and he begins to leave them. They call him back and say, would you have dinner with us? Would you dine with us here tonight? So they go and have dinner, and it's not until the breaking of the bread that they actually recognize him as Jesus. But I think in this story we have the elements of the practice of servant leadership. And you can see it in some of the examples that I provided. There is this intense focus to walk with. And so I think the practice of servant leadership, no matter what the role we're in, is trying to become very grounded in whoever we're trying to serve, or, we could, you could put this in more of a business context, in the experience of our customers or our key stakeholders, whomever that might be, so that we are very comfortable. In my sort of, conversations and engagement with our team on the fundraising side of the university, and we're in all different, we've got all different roles and responsibilities. I encourage everybody on our team to make sure that they talk with donors and alumni and our parents on a regular basis. Those conversations will inform and help ground our work and everything we do. And a lot of it is the practice of sort of being sort of in this relationship with those that we are trying to serve. So there's the practice of walking with. And then there's the really difficult practice of listening to. And so what you find, so if I think about Scotty, right? He spent 90% or more of his time just listening to. And it was his sort of ability to walk with and listen to that for me sort of really elevated him as an example of servant leadership. Probably there's another element which I think can often be the most difficult, and that's speaking truth. So I think what we see with servant leaders is this ability to speak truth. And as I sort of review the literature around servant leadership, some of the critique is that it's sort of so soft, and that it's really sort of wishy-washy, and quote-unquote sort of holier than thou. I actually think where it has a bit more teeth is in the speaking truth. It's in the ability to walk with and listen to, and then articulate sort of the truth that is grounded in that, very hard experience of all that relationship and interaction, and in some ways sort of calling out a vision which may be different than others might see. So I think there is the speaking truth. And the final part is the breaking bread. So what you have in servant leadership is something that is very much grounded in relationship. And And sort of I look at it and say that this model is absolutely a relationship-centric model of leading. I think it can absolutely have sort of a bottom-line orientation. My experience of servant leaders is I think there's incredible humility combined with a fierce drive to create sort of a better, sort of a better state or some, sort of end goal. There's another component here that what you see in this sort of practice is a real focus on, if you look at it in sort of an organizational setting, on the development and the growth of all those people in the organization. And so there's because of the relationship focus, there's a really strong commitment to sort of the growth and the development of everybody in the organization or on the team. So to me, the practice is, how do you walk with, listen to, speak truth, and break bread? So that's a part of the practice. Now, I think there's some implications of this. The one implication is that servant leaders really aren't bounded by sort of organizational structure. And so you can exert servant leadership if you're Rosie by being in building services. Or if you're Scotty by working in the basement of the Center for the Homeless. Or if you happen to be someone like the Pope. So you can exert that sort of servant leadership by your example and sort of by your ethos. I think there's a passion for mission among servant leaders. They are inspired by a mission that is just much greater than themselves. So there's very little thought whatsoever to personal gain or prestige. Because for them, it's all about the mission. It's all about the mission, and it's all about those who are part of that mission with them. I do think that there's a communication style to servant leadership. My sense is that servant leaders really use story and symbolism to communicate their sort of mission and vision. So I think they're able to, like Golda Meir was able to do, create this narrative where people can identify their place in the narrative in the story. Much the way that I think Pope Francis is doing today. I just had it was a real blessing. I was given a rosary that was blessed by Pope Francis. And I was talking to the person who gave it to me, and I said, my personal belief is that we've sort of been in a period of culturally a period of great judgment, and I look at the last 25 years of a time of sort of great judgment. And for me, sort of the message at least the one I'm hearing or I'm picking up on from Pope Francis is a message of mercy and a message of forgiveness. And I think that what we see in servant leaders is this ability to create a narrative that for their organizations is very inclusive and sort of transcends the typical divisions that we would identify. As I've shared a little bit, I think there's a real rare combination of humility and will. For those who might read the Jim Collins literature, I actually have gotten to know Jim Collins over the years a little bit. He did some pro bono work with the Center for the Homeless while I was the director. You look at the Jim Collins work and he talks about level 5 leaders. I would say if you look at sort of the attributes of that level 5 leader, you'll see a lot of these same qualities of sort of servant leadership. But one of them is this sort of rare combination of intense humility combined with intense drive. And in that case, it's interesting to me because I'll get a chance to work at times fairly closely with Father John, and I see that combination of intense humility, but at the same time really intense drive. And I think that's what we see in sort of servant leadership. So I don't see them at all as sort of being weak or being sort of really sweet or saccharine-like. I actually think there's incredible strength in that style of leadership. So, to conclude a little bit, how do we sort of put this in practice? And I do articulate this as a practice because I think it's like any other discipline. It's really the repetition of the how do you do this. One, I think it's really important to sort of identify mentors in your life for whatever part of your life, but people who you think may embody some of these qualities. And what I would say is when we come to servant leadership, don't necessarily look at sort of the typical positions of leadership to look for those mentors. Because I think you have to sort of widen the lens and look all around. Because when you do, I actually think that you'll find mentors in your life who embody this, this sort of perspective and the way they try to sort of humbly lead in their own way, in their own place. I think we just need to begin by asking ourselves some really simple questions. How can we be of service to those on our team? How can... I remember my grandfather, who was in the had an 8th grade education and rose to the ranks of senior management in a pharmaceutical company in New York City. And he told me that one of his most interesting experience was and he worked for the company president for many years, and that president always finished his one-on-one meetings with his direct reports by saying, was this of service to you? Was this of service to you? So it's this, I think we can ask ourselves, how can we be of service to those on our team? You can certainly go beyond that. I mean, whether it's to our team, to our students. In my case, I can think of our alumni, our benefactors, our parents as well. We can think of to our community. We can certainly think of this to our family. And we can absolutely think of this to our customers. How can we be of service? But it's not the asking the question one time. It's constantly going back, and that's what I mean by sort of the practice of servant leadership. And I think it's the discipline of asking those questions and then acting on the insight that ends up being the practice of servant leadership. I think the model of walking with, listening to, speaking truth, and breaking bread just gives us a good framework by which we can try to practice servant leadership. I think there's an intense component of being a part of a team or of being a part of sort of a larger organization. In my experience, there's almost no I and no me in a servant leadership type of approach. And there is this sort of overriding focus on the growth and well-being of those who are around us. That is sort of part of servant leadership. Now, there's a favorite quote of mine that I learned from my boss, Lou Nanny, and he has used it many times. But it sort of gets to this practice of servant leadership. And it's a quote, I'll close with this, it's a quote from St. Benedict. If you think you've gotten ahead, it is a sign you have fallen behind. Be content to be a beginner. So if you think you've gotten ahead, it's a sign that you've fallen behind. Be content to be a beginner. Thank you. Great to be with you today. Sure.
How about questions? Comments, questions? With plenty of time?
You talked a lot about like servant leadership and kind of these like lower level roles. Can you talk a little bit about like how we could be servant leaders in jobs that we might be like pursuing out of undergrad, like when we're sitting in an office for however many hours a day?
So for those who didn't hear the question is, hey, if I'm taking my first job and I'll be in sort of an office environment and just sort of be interacting, so there's some things that I would say is, one, take a real relationship-based approach to all of your coworkers, right? So that's sort of the walking with. Understand what their experience is, their own insights, what's important to them. Now, whatever your role, I would try to understand who is the next user of whatever service or product that you're delivering, right? And I try to be really grounded in what's the experience that someone is having of the end use of my work. Because that sort of, dynamic of what you're doing and how it's impacting others gets to sort of the crux of this, because it seems to me that sort of servant leadership really sort of understands both the team that you're a part of and the growth of your team, but then also sort of the impact of it. Probably one other perspective on it is I would really try to figure out how can you participate in a project, or how can you be of service of people outside of your own direct team? So you may find that you're engaging with other departments or other stakeholders to the degree that you can be of service and support and help those. I mean, my experience here at Notre Dame is that, in the nature of university relations work, and especially on sort of the fundraising side of it, is we depend upon the rest of the university to help us engage and hopefully inspire and involve our alumni, our parents, and our benefactors. So some of the most important work that influences sort of what we do is not done by us at all. It's delivered and distributed all around campus. And I can think of a dozen people who are absolutely critical to our efforts that, their reporting line is so far away from university relations. So I think something that new employees can do is really try to understand what are some of the key stakeholders within the organization, and how can you be of service to others. Other questions or thoughts or comments?
You mentioned that you encourage your staff to speak with donors and alumni and parents as part of like building relations. But at the end of the day, my understanding of the development office is that it's there to serve the university and the students. Do you ever encourage your office staff to speak with students?
So great question. So the question is sort of engagement with, with our students. I would say at the end of the day, our role is to build the entire university, students, faculty, and staff. So one way that we try to encourage our staff is just by all the students that we employ in our own, in university relations. And making sure that our team is grounded with our students, and that we create opportunities for our staff, I'm going to say in a fairly regular basis, to be interacting with, with students. Now sometimes that just means attending sort of university functions that are, sort of student-led or, sort of student-oriented. And then there's particular parts of our organization on the development side that is really student-focused, right? So you have the call center, completely student, oriented, but it's part of the operation. But it's how we engage in that, sort of relationship. In our own office we have a core number, and then what I'll encourage our team to do is just to, get to know some of the students of families that we just may know. There's some easy ways to do it. But it can be, a real challenge too, just to sort of figure out how do you have that discipline of engagement with, with students. I would say we seem to be a bit more attentive to students when they're juniors and seniors, because they will then graduate and become alumni, than we may be with students who are first and second years. Good question. Yeah.
Yes, you mentioned breaking bread as being one of the major parts of the fundamental framework of being a servant leader. So I was just kind of wondering if you could go into more detail about ways to implement that principle of being a servant leader.
Yeah. So the breaking bread is, on the direct side, it's how do you sit down and have a meal with somebody? But the principle is how do you sort of really engage in relationship, and I think that's the art of servant leadership. The art is how do you, in a regular and disciplined way, focus on sort of building these relationships with those who are perhaps part of your immediate team, but then sort of then beyond it, and. Like your question about students, I think that's often where there's the greatest degree of discomfort. Because the nature of relationship in sort of real relationship is that there's some vulnerability there and there's some level of intimacy there. So I think this is, and to your question, that really gets to the heart of it, because this is a relationship-centric approach. So how do you regularly sort of push yourself to sort of build and engage in that kind of relationship sometimes outside of what you're normally doing, because it can seem like it's an extra, and hey, that's number 4 or 5 on the list. That's not the top 3 that needs to get done at that particular point. Are there other questions or thoughts or observations? Yes.
You mentioned a lot about just being there to listen to people and to be open to a lot of communication. I was wondering what advice we would give to leadership roles that involve a lot of decision making, and when you have to communicate back to them when it really is your turn to speak.
So the question is about, the model is grounded in sort of listening, and but what about when you're in the role where you have to make a lot of decisions, and how do you do that? I actually think that the model, and so at times that's where the sort of the speaking truth comes in, because as leaders you will be called on to make decisions, and many decisions people will interpret as, somebody won and somebody lost. Whether it's a decision about resources, it could be a decision about strategy, it could be a decision about sort of the roles and responsibilities that people play. I think when there's an authenticity to the leader, that they're grounded in the relationship and the experience of the team, and there's a level of trust, those difficult decisions, I don't want to say become easier, but they are, there's fertile ground for them to occur. And so you can absolutely make those decisions and communicate them. Because I think in this model, I think the model itself engenders more trust than not. But it doesn't, by no means does it mean that the traditional sort of roles and responsibilities of leaders to sort of make the decisions is any easier. I would argue it could very well be more informed, and perhaps qualitatively they may make different decisions too. Yes, back.
This is more of a comment, but I know I attended a talk recently and the speaker talked about how true leadership really occurs when you're not worried about who gets the credit. I think that kind of resonated with your point about passion for the mission and not the prestige associated with any decisions made.
No, I think it's a great comment. I think my observations of these various roles that I've sort of come to, and these people that I've come to sort of view as, servant leaders, is that it's just this rare combination. I mean, I don't know how else to describe it, of intense humility and at the same time sort of an intense drive. And it seems to be a very other-centered focus. And for me, that's what I meant in the beginning when I said, boy, it's hard to define it, but you know it when you feel it. Because I think you do, I think it's not just sort of an intellectual experience when you are around, servant leaders. There's just something about them that you sort of know and sort of command some level of respect and attention on your part. And one of those things is, there's just far less I in whatever sort of goal they're trying to attain. And in many ways, I would say their greatest joy is in sort of team fulfillment or organizational sort of fulfillment, and seeing how other people sort of grow and develop and identify with that, with whatever that organization is doing or that, sort of that cause. So that seems to sort of really inspire them. Great. Anything else? Yes?
One of those things that really identifies Pope Francis is that he has managed to get a following not only inside the church but outside the church. Do you think it's his service leadership qualities that make him attract so many people?
Yes. Yeah, I do. I mean, I think I think that, but I do think what you see with sort of servant leadership is people can articulate a reality that sort of transcends their own sort of organization and their own sort of perspective. So that you would find in the case of Pope Francis that the people who are whether not Catholic or Christian or whatever it is might look to him now and as a major moral authority in the world. Because of, in some ways, because of how he is, not just what he's preaching, but all these little things that he is sort of doing that sort of demonstrate, I think, his own authenticity as a servant, as a servant leader. So I think your point is, I think you're right on track. Yes.
A minute ago, do you think Rosie would describe herself as a servant leader, or did Father Jenkins wake up one morning and say, I think I'm going to be a servant leader? So, is that capacity within all of us in this room?
Well, I think you're asking two different questions. I think your first question I'll answer very literally. I can't speak for Rosie. I think it is who she is, and I think she fully expresses her desire to be of service to others. And would she articulate that she's exerting any leadership? I don't know. I can tell you, people around me in the Dome would probably agree with some of the things I would say about Rosie. But I don't know if she would sort of ascribe to that. Father John probably, I think he really identifies himself as priest-president, and as his vocation is one of service. I don't think, from what I've heard Father John say, that he's ever had any great aspirations for leadership. I think he's had aspirations to be a call to serve, and in so doing, he's been obedient to the call to lead that he's been asked to, asked to do. But is it an attribute that's within all of us? I would argue yes. My own sort of disposition is, I think we're all called to be of service to others. Now, how that manifests itself, how it takes shape, I think is our own journey. And with that, I think some people aspire, in their desire to be of service, aspire to lead, and will join the two, sort of the two together. And that may take much more formal, the shape of sort of pursuing formal roles of, more traditional sort of positions, et cetera, of leadership. But, by some of the people I mentioned, Scotty, had he ever heard the term servant leadership? I don't think so. But for me, he ended up being a great mentor in my life, and I would attribute him as a servant leader. Yes?
Do you feel sometimes that certain leaders are prone to, I guess, over-commit or always trying to give themselves and at the expense of their own time?
Maybe. I think there's this. I think there is a commitment to the well-being of others, right, and to the growth and the well-being of others. And I think there's an intense pursuit of mission. And often, when you find those two together, you can find people who sort of deplete themselves, right? So they sort of overextend, and then they need to figure out how to regenerate and rejuvenate. My sense, that's sort of part of the journey. Now, this is probably an overstatement. I think overcommitment, right, at times is a reflection of insecurity. And I don't see servant leaders as being insecure. So that's if I'm peeling back the onion a little bit, if I think about all my experience of people who have been really overcommitted, I might challenge on that sort of dimension. But it could be part of someone's own growth. Any other sort of questions or comments? Yes?
As far as the combination of service and leadership, do you think that leadership is something that comes with as you get more involved in the service you are called to lead versus just wanting to serve? And do you think there's like a relation that leadership comes with being more involved in service? Do you feel like you should continue and promote the service more?
Yes, on the surface. I think people will respond to sort of this call to serve, and as they're sort of walking with, sort of listening to, breaking bread and sort of speaking truth, I think they will see the opportunities for leadership and will identify that in their effort to serve, they can pursue or in some ways demonstrate leadership. But I think it's important that we see servant first, leadership second, because I think with leadership there's so many connotations that come with sort of the trappings of sort of prestige and power and possessions and influence. That I think it is. Yeah, I think you're right. I think your insight's right on there. Yes.
I think one question I had as we've been talking about this is the idea of when you said there, more of that focus on serving first and that drive for service. What advice would you have maybe for people who feel maybe they're starting in new jobs, starting in new organizations, and maybe they feel like they're being met with opposition to that commitment to service, that drive? Do you think there's anything more we could do to try and instill that idea of service, that drive to service for those people around us, besides forming the relationships and that kind of relationship style? Is there more that we can do in addition to that?
I think it first starts with the example of how an individual interacts with others, right? So I think the powerful example of being of service, right? So I would say that that's where it starts. And that can quickly then follow with sort of encouraging others to sort of, perhaps take similar approaches and practices. And at times you have to be really smart about it, right? In terms of saying, hey, if I know the organization that I'm a part of is really organized around this one key metric, how can I demonstrate that this sort of service orientation can help influence our team performance, right? I mean, that's in many ways, I think that's the savviness that often comes with leadership, is that leaders see that opportunity to sort of connect what may seem disparate sort of ideas, together. But I think when it comes to servant leadership, I think it begins with sort of personal example than anything else. Great. Thank you. Great to be with you.